Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Namo Krishna Krishna Vishnu Radha Govinda Goswami Namine Namaste Prabhupada Devi Ramya Jananishtarini. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So reading today from Grantharaj Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 6, Chapter 2, Text 14 and 15, but we'll be reciting Text 14. Sanketyam parihasyam va stobham helanameva va Vaikuntha namagrahanam Asheshagha haram viduhu Sanketyam parihasyam va Stobham helanameva va Vaikuntha namagrahanam Asheshagha haram viduhu Sanketyam parihasyam va Stobham helanameva va Vaikuntha namagrahanam Asheshagha haram viduhu. Sanketyam parihasyam va Stobham helanameva va Vaikuntham namagrahanam Asheshaga haram viduhu. Sanketyam parihasyam va Stobham helanameva va Vaikuntha namagrahanam Asheshaga haram viduhu. Sanketyam parihasyam va Stobham helanameva va Vaikuntha namagrahanam Asheshaga haram viduhu. Sanketyam parihasyam va Stobham helanameva va Vaikuntha namagrahanam Asheshagha haram viduhu. Sanketyam, as an assignation. Parihasyam, jokingly. Va, or Stobham, as musical entertainment. Helanam, neglectfully. Eva, certainly. Va, or Vaikuntha, of the Lord. Namagrahanam, chanting the holy name. Ashesha, unlimited. Aghaharam, neutralizing the effect of sinful life. Viduhu, advanced transcendentalists know. Translation. One who chants the holy name of the Lord is immediately freed from the reactions of unlimited sins, even if he chants indirectly to indicate something else, jokingly, for musical entertainment, or even neglectfully. This is accepted by all the learned scholars of the scriptures. And then we'll recite text 15. I think most of you have your phones, so if you want, you can repeat after. Patitas khalito bhagnaha sandashtastapta ahataha harir ityavashenaha pumanarhati yatanaha. And the translation there is, if one chants the holy name of Hari and then dies because of an accidental misfortune, such as falling from the top of a house, slipping and suffering broken bones while traveling on the road, being bitten by a serpent, being afflicted with pain and high fever, or being injured by a weapon, one is immediately absolved from having to enter hellish life, even though he is sinful. Purport. As is stated in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 8, text 6, Yam yam vapi smaram bhavam tyajatyante kalevaram tam tam evaiti kaunteya sada tad bhava bhavitaha. Whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, that state he will attain without fail. If one practices chanting the Hare Krishna Mahamantra, he is naturally expected to chant Hare Krishna when he meets with some accident. Even without such practice, however, if one somehow or other chants the holy name of the Lord, Hare Krishna, when he meets with an accident and dies, he will be saved from hellish life after death. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Jai. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Utapada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan tam sajivam sadvaitam savadhutam parijana sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha. He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gourangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Goratvishe Namaha Vansha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhaktavrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So today we are reading, especially for the World Holy Name Week. We are going through different select texts, and today we are doing a very famous text. This one is very well known, from a very well-known pastime. This is one of those pastimes that's very commonly recited. It's almost common knowledge. I know whenever I visit my relatives, they're all if you will, by and large, nominally Gauriya Vaishnavas. So, so they would identify as Gauriya Vaishnavas, but they're not regularly reading Prabhupada's books, right? I'll say it like that, right? But this is one of the pastimes that they'll always say whenever I'll bring up, whenever we'll discuss. They'll always say, "Oh, a Jamil," right? Jamil's one of the famous ones. Actually, and there's another one. I was with my grandmother, who is observant Gauriya Vaishnava. She chants and reads regularly and everything. But I still remember I bought her a copy of Chaitanya Bhagavat, because I was reading how Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada, he said that, if one has a capacity for the Bengali language, one should study Chaitanya Bhagavat, because it's very accessible, Bengali. So I got for my grandmother. And anyway, so I just let her read, and then we were visiting Mayapur together at the time. And then I remember, so the one morning, I got up and I just looked where the bookmark was up to, and I saw it was I'm just mind blanking, Jain Vijay in Jagai Madhai, yeah. So Jagai Madhai, it was the Jagai Madhai chapter, right? And so I thought, wow, she's going very quickly through this. And so I thought, wow. And then the next morning, I went to check where she was up to. I was just curious, for discussion, right? And then I saw again, oh, Jagai Madhai. I thought maybe she's really relishing this chapter. And then the next morning I opened it up and I saw again Jagai Madhai, and I thought, oh, okay. And then I asked her, I said, what are you reading? And she said she just skipped to the Jagai Madhai chapter, and she's just been reading every day, right? This Jagai Madhai chapter is also like this, right? So there's some pastimes that we hear very often, right? There's these very common pastimes that we like to speak, we like to hear. And sometimes we can almost feel we've heard them so often, right? So many times we've heard them. I still remember once we were planning some youth reading group at the beginning of COVID, right? We all know all of these great devotional initiatives started at COVID and they also ended in COVID, right? So all of these sort of initiatives happened. And so one of them was a reading group. And together we were planning on sitting down and reading Prabhupada's books, one text or something. Anyways, they were all discussing. And I said, well, let's read Ishopanishad. Ishopanishad is a nice book. It has lengthy purports, but is also not intimidating. So that way, if we do one text a week, it gives us a lot to digest and a lot to discuss. Anyways, but then one other devotee who was there, they said, actually, let's not do Ishopanishad. And I asked, oh, why not? And they said, I've read it once. I don't need to read it again. So I was thinking, with all due respect to that individual, that's not the approach, right, that we have, right? Reading it once, almost, it should make us more willing to read it a second time, right? Actually, the first read-through, the first 10 read-throughs, the first 100 read-throughs, the main thing we learn is that we don't really know much about this book, right? That is the main thing we learn. It's not that we've actually learnt much about Ishopanishad or Srimad Bhagavatam or anything from the first read-through, the second read-through, the third read-through. At least that's my experience, right? Every time I read through Prabhupada's books, I think, I want to say I haven't, even though I'm going through whichever amount of times it is, the first time I went through, obviously I felt like I didn't know. And then I was very happy, I was very proudly telling people the first time I read through Prabhupada's books, I said, yeah, I've read through Prabhupada's books once time. And then when I finished the second time, I thought, actually, I should count this as my first time, right? Because what did I really understand at the first time? And then the third time, I thought, okay, no, actually, this is the time that I want to say this is the first time. And like that, right? So you go through Prabhupada's books, and the more you read them, the more you think, I'm feeling less qualified, actually, by reading them, right? So this is the way that we go through Shastra. This is the way that we go through reading all these things. And so these famous pastimes, they're famous for a reason. It's not that they're famous because they're simple or they're for beginners or anything like that. We can think the same thing with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, right? Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, when he's there in Jagannath Puri, he's there and he's experiencing very, very high things. We know when he's in Puri, when he's in South India, when he's in Navadvip, there he's establishing Sankirtan. But when Mahaprabhu goes to Puri, that's when he's doing, his very internal pastimes. That's when he's attempting to embrace the mood of Srimati Radharani, right? We know high things, right? I still remember when back in COVID, when Ganesham Prabhu, he asked me to give the Chaitanya Charitamrita classes, right, from Madhya Lila. I still remember I was thinking, once we finish Madhya Lila, I'm stopping. I'm not even going to try to speak on Antya Lila, right? I'll leave that for much more qualified devotees, right? Antya Lila, we hear very, very high elevated things. But what do we hear? Mahaprabhu, what is he hearing during this time? He's hearing the pastimes from Gadadhar Pandit, who is none other than Srimati Radharani herself, so we're getting very, very esoteric. But what is he hearing from Srimati Radharani's partial incarnation in Gadadhar Pandit? What is he hearing? He's hearing the pastimes of Dhruva Maharaj and Prahlad Maharaj, right? So it's not that Mahaprabhu is there and he's thinking, because these stories also, right? We can think of Jamil, Dhruva Maharaj, Prahlad Maharaj. These are the very, bread and butter, right? even the small children right here, right? They'll have heard already a few times this pastime, right? They'll probably be able to say this a Jamil pastime better than I can, right? So we hear this from a small age. We'll hear these pastimes, right? And then we'll think, right? Oh, this is some sort of beginning thing. But Mahaprabhu, right? Mahaprabhu there to taste, the highest of all things, right? And yet he's still relishing this pastime, right? Countless times he heard those pastimes. So these pastimes are very significant. They're very powerful. They're not just the ABCs, right? They're very, very deep, and very, very profound. And so we hear famous pastimes like this, and this text itself is rather famous, and we'll discuss a little more about the text a little bit later. Of course, this text is describing, what is it describing? It's describing the glories of the holy name, but it's describing the glories of the holy name chanted in a certain way. Which way is that? What is it? Which type of holy name is particularly being referred to here? Sorry? Yeah, there's the technical name we hear. We hear there's Namaparad, there's Shuddha Nam, and then there's one in the middle. Is Namabhas, right? So this text is discussing Namabhas. And interestingly, and I'll come back to it a little later, but we'll see that this way of describing Namabhas is a little different to the way we normally hear Namabhas, right? Normally we hear Namabhas being described of two kinds. And I promise I won't ask too many questions today, but do we know the two types of Namabhas that are normally discussed? There is Chaya Namabhas and there's Pratibimba Namabhas. Chaya, of course, means sorry? Pratibimba, I think, is the reflection, right? Chaya is the shadow, yeah. So there's Chaya, and then there's Pratibimba. And the Pratibimba is the reflection, right? And Chaya is the shadow, right? We normally hear this as the two types of Namabhas. But here we are hearing there's 4 types. Well, actually 5, right? There's 5 types of Namabhas. We're reading here. What are we seeing? We're seeing, even if one chants indirectly, this is the first type that is being listed here. Jokingly. Of course, jokingly, not offensively, right? Because then it's Namaparad. That's the elaboration given by our acharyas. It's if it's a casual joke, like, oh wow, you're as strong as Krishna, right? Somebody might say that, right? That is a joke, right? But it's not an offensive joke. So this is the type of joking that's referred to here. For musical entertainment, what's meant here is sometimes you'll see, in order to do poetry or something, we know poetry has a rhythm, right? That's why Bhagavad Gita shlokas, they flow so easily. In 5th canto, we'll see it is not so poetic at times, and it's really difficult to recite, right? So we'll see like this, right? So sometimes, in order to complete poetry, people they'll throw in a Govinda, they'll throw in a Hari, they'll throw in something like that, right? They'll just sort of mix it in order to complete the meter, right? This is the other form of Namapas, and this is what is meant by musical entertainment, right? For musical purposes, they've thrown in the holy name, right? And then lastly, even neglectfully. Neglectfully, this means almost in a casual sort of way, right? The word that's used is also the word that's used when Krishna, he lifts up Govardhan hill, right? So we can think of how casually Krishna lifts it up in this way when one takes the holy name, Namapas. And then the 5th way that's mentioned is in text 15, right? And we hear all of these gruesome ways of dying, right? And it's said if one is in a situation, sometimes we'll see devotees, they'll stub their toe and they'll go, oh, Krishna, right? Oh, Govinda, right? This is another form of Namapas, right? So we're hearing here 5 types of Namapas. But this is a different way than what we're used to hearing, right? What we're used to hearing is Pratibimba and Chaya Namapas. So there's a distinction to be made among the two. And after we make the distinction, I'll speak a little bit on the pastime, and then we'll come back to all this technical details about chanting. The main difference is that this form of Namabhas is with faithless Namabhas. This is Namabhas which is not done with some sort of intent to receive the mercy of the holy name, right? This is faithless Namabhas. This is almost unintentional Namabhas, we can say, which is of course what a Jamil has done. A Jamil has not attempted any sadhana, right? This is the Namabhas which occurs outside of sadhana, right? Like this. So we'll see all sorts of cases. I remember in my high school, one of my friends, he again in a non-offensive way, he found it sweet, right, that I was Hare Krishna, right? So every time he would see me, he'd go, "Oh, Hari Hari," like that. He would say like that, right? He's not trying any sadhana there, right? That he wasn't thinking, okay, there we go. There's my daily vrat complete of holy name, right? He would just see me and he would say, "Oh, Hari Hari," right? Like that he would say. This would be considered this type of Namapas, right? Because he wasn't doing it in an offensive way. He was doing it in a sweet way, right? But he wasn't doing it in any sort of way. But when we speak about chaya and when we speak about pratibimba namabhas, this is when it is done with some sort of faith, with some sort of intent. So that's why we're having these two lists. It's not that these two lists are merged together. They're two separate categories of namabhas, right? This sort of semblance of the holy name. And of course then, pratibimba and chaya, we hear those two. One is the shadow, one is the reflection. Which one is greater, the shadow or the reflection? Who knows? Which one is greater? Which one is better? Which one would we rather be chanting? Would we want to aim the shadow or would we want the reflection? We can think of a tree. That's often what's used. There's the tree of the holy name, this beautiful Vanchakalpaturu, right? This wonderful desire tree, right? That is the holy name. And we can think one Namabhas is the shadow which is cast by the tree. And the other Namabhas is the reflection in a pond. Which one would we rather chant? The reflection or the shadow? It's alright if you get it wrong. It's really 50-50. Sorry? Shadow, correct. Right? Prabhu is correct. The shadow is better. The shadow is the one which is blocked by anarthas. But the reflection, this is because of some incorrect sort of impersonalistic conception one will have. When they have an incorrect conception like that, and then this will happen. And the reason why the reflection is not as good is because we can think a reflection is very nice, right? A reflection is very sweet. Oh, we see all the colors and everything, right? And sometimes we'll see this, we'll see Mayavadis, sometimes they'll be chanting and we'll think, wow, here's some Mayavadi in the Himalayas and he's standing on his one thumb of his left hand for 20 years and he's chanting non-stop, 132 rounds a day. Wow, we'll think like this. But if we see the reflection, a reflection actually has no connection to the item it's reflecting. When you look at the pond and you see the tree, what happens if you try to touch that tree in the reflection? What happens? The tree goes away. The reflection becomes disturbed. And it physically has no connection. But the shadow is more humble, right? The shadow is more humble. It doesn't have all of these sweet colors. It doesn't have any of this. But the shadow, it is connected to the tree. If you trace up the shadow, eventually you will touch the tree. No matter how much you touch the reflection, you will never reach the tree. But eventually, simply by associating with the shadow, we know we can't escape our shadows, especially a tree can't escape its shadow, right? Because the tree can't escape anything. Very immobile, right? So because of that, eventually, even though the shadow might seem less impressive, right? The shadow actually has more substance to it. So like this, we hear. So this is intentional chanting, right? And the shadow, of course, is there. It's a shadowy form because it's blocked by anarthas and stuff like that. But we will discuss that later. Anyway, so this pastime, right, is a very glorious pastime. It's one of these essential ones, really, for establishing Siddhanta. If you read the Acharya's commentaries, they actually don't write such long commentaries. Everyone thinks that they'll be writing long purports, but their purports aren't so long. Srila Prabhupada, he writes long purports, right? Very long and sweet purports. Actually, I was reading, a little bit tangential, but I was reading one academic. They analyzed Srila Prabhupada's purports and they compared them to the purports of Sridhar Swami, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, the previous acharyas. And what they did is they read all of the purports of Srila Prabhupada, compared them to the previous acharyas, and they wanted to find all of the places where Prabhupada adds some extra realization. As we know, Prabhupada, he primarily takes the previous acharyas and then he digests them and he represents the same knowledge, right? But in some areas, Prabhupada will add his own realizations, his own conceptions, his own new points, right, on the text. And so this academic did it and compiled them all together and compiled them on topic. And you'll find really interestingly, Prabhupada, the overwhelming majority of his additions that are unique to Srila Prabhupada are either about Varnashram and social issues, or are about smashing Mayavad. right? So this is Prabhupada's unique mood, right? This is what we can find. And we'll know this, right? You read Prabhupada's books and you'll find every second page, right? We're either smashing Mayavadis or we're talking about the degraded state of modern civilization, right? So this is the unique flavor of Srila Prabhupada's purports. Anyways, so Prabhupada's purports are long. But the previous acharyas on this chapter, right? You'll find, especially in the BBT edition, we find there's an appendix for chapter 2. And it lists just one purport that Chakravarti Thakur has written, and it goes on for pages, right? This is a very essential chapter. This chapter, and also the first chapter of Canto 7. These are two particularly very valuable chapters. We know chapter 1 of Canto 7 is important because it describes Rag Bhakti, right? The glories of being attached spontaneously to the Supreme Lord in meditation. It is indirectly glorified through the glorification, if you will, of Shishupal. Anyways, so this chapter is very, very significant. And it begins with a very relatable question. Maharaj Parikshit, he has heard, of course, we are studying Canto 6. And just earlier in Canto 5, what do we hear? Canto 5 is famous for what? There's actually a few things in it, but everyone knows it very famously for? What is in Canto 5? Sorry? Yes, there's that. And then after that, what do we hear? The cosmology. The cosmology, yeah. So, Prabhu, you're correct. And then right after, we find the cosmology. That's the thing, whenever you ask what is in this canto, there's, quite literally unlimited answers of what is in each canto, right? So there's the cosmology, right? And we hear all the cosmological descriptions. And of course, we've heard the description of the heavenly planets, but we've much more worryingly heard the description of the hellish planets, right? This becomes very concerning, right? I know whenever you read the hellish planets, I still remember when I was little, and I read through, I wasn't reading, I was just looking through the pictures, right, of our Srimad Bhagavatam at home and Bhagavad Gita. I still remember I would get nightmares, right, of all the pictures of the hellish planets, how all the people are tortured. I remember I would get so scared. My parents had to tell me, if you're chanting Hare Krishna, you don't need to worry so much. So, So like this, we hear all of these very scary descriptions, right? And so hearing these very scary descriptions, Maharaj Parikshit, he asks, and he says, well, how can one attain the heavenly planets? How can one avoid these hellish planets, right? How can one do all of these things? This is, you've told me all of this. I'm very concerned now, right? You've so wonderfully described all of these things. How can I maintain myself? And so, Maharaj Parikshit, he asks this. And Shukadev Goswami, he gives an initial answer. And his initial answer is, of course, one observes the injunctions found in the Manusmriti, right? The Manu Sanghita. He says all of this, right? He says one can atone for one's sinful activities, one can follow all of these principles. And of course, Maharaj Parikshit, he has heard enough of Srimad Bhagavatam to know not to be satisfied with this answer. And he says, these things, maybe we can do some sort of atonement. We know the famous text, right? Like an elephant that bathes itself and then becomes muddy again. We also hear another analogy. It's sort of like weeds, right? When we cut weeds, the weeds just grow back, right? Because they're there in a dormant state. You need to pull weeds out. You can't just trim them. So all of these things, they're simply like trimming weeds. My spiritual master, he says, actually, all of these dharma shastras, the Manusmriti and all, they were written by great personalities, but written by great personalities for very foolish personalities, right? Very foolish people who are very ignorant of the true nature of reality. That is who they're written for, right? These are for people who need things to be complicated and sophisticated, right? The most intelligent person, they will hear that by chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, that by chanting this, then, one's sinful reactions will be absolved. Simply one can exist on this bhakti marg and one needs not worry. But foolish people, they will think, it's not that easy. Oh, I still have to do this. I still have to do that, right? They will think all of these things, and therefore Manusmriti was written, right? So for these people, they can entertain themselves, right? They can entertain their desires to be very sophisticated, very fancy. And then in their foolishness, they will most likely continue in samsara. If they're very, very fortunate, they may obtain birth as a demigod or something, right? If they're very fortunate. So they'll go through all of this effort for that. So Parikshit Maharaj, he saw through that, right? And he asked much, much deeper, right? And so, of course, then we hear that Shukadev Goswami, he says, let us hear about the pastimes of a Jamil. And of course, we know a Jamil, he was a very pious Brahmin. Sometimes people will think he was sinful from the beginning, but actually he was a very observant, pious Brahmin. It's described in Srimad Bhagavatam that he's coming from a family of Brahmins, and actually his wife as well, right, came from a very, very good family. This is described in Srimad Bhagavatam as well. The Sanskrit word that's used, I'm now forgetting, I think it's lambati, right, is indicated. This word is only used for a wife that is given intentionally by the father's desire, right? So not only did she come from a Brahminical family, but came by very nice Brahminical arrangements, right? This is what is described. So the description is given, his wife not only came from a Brahminical family, not only did he come from a Brahminical family, but their life was very Brahminical, very ordered, very structured. And therefore, he is also described as a brahmachari, right? We find a Jamil, he is described, obviously not later on in his life, but at the beginning, even in his married life, he is described as a brahmachari in Srimad Bhagavatam. Because we know perfect grihastha life, or even acceptable grihastha life, should be equivalent to brahmacharya, right? The freedoms of the grihastha ashram are meant to be balanced out by the responsibilities of the grihastha ashram, right? There is freedom given in order to do the service, right? Of course, these days the grihastha ashram is treated, the freedoms are given for freedom's sake, right? I'm free to do this so I can enjoy, right? But actually those freedoms are given so that those services can be done, right? Grihasthas are able to make money for the purpose of giving that money to the brahmanas and to the brahmacharis, right? This is the reason why grihasthas are allowed to make money, right? Grihasthas are allowed to engage in conjugal relations in order to produce bodies for Vaishnavas, right? But then some people will think, oh no, I'm allowed to because I'm allowed to, right? Because it's some time pass, right? This will be the conception that is held, right? But this is not the nature of the grihastha ashram, because then it is not an ashram. An ashram is a place one takes shelter in, right? The ashram is for shelter, but what shelter is it if one is just abusing it, right? So actually all of these freedoms are there, but these freedoms are meant for the purpose of service, right? They're not meant for any other purpose. And if they're not done for that purpose, then it's not grihastha and it's not ashram, right? So, because of this, we find that a Jamil, he was described as a brahmachari, right? Grihastha life is, in its ideal, as perfect as brahmacharya, right? I still remember once I was hearing a class by His Holiness Jayadvaita Swami Maharaj. I was in Mayapur. And Jayadvaita Maharaj, he was speaking about the glories of vanaprastha, right? And he was really going hard. We all know Jayadvaita Maharaj, he gives very, very heavy classes, right? And he was speaking heavily and he was saying, as all of the grihasthas here, you should all aim. You should really see it as the ideal, right? Once your children are old enough, once you are stable enough, then you should aim for vanaprastha, right? You should hold this as your ideal, not simply that you should think, I will keep on going my whole life. Vanaprastha should be your aim, right? You should be orienting your whole existence around vanaprastha. And like this, he was speaking, right? Very heavily. It was, you saw, right? Everyone dressed in saffron was smiling, and everyone dressed in white was a little bit, was taking it very heavily, because it was very heavy, right? It was a very, very heavy class, right? And so Maharaj, he was speaking like this. And then one devotee, one young devotee actually, right? He put his hand up in the questions. And he said, Maharaj, you are saying the importance that we should take vanaprastha, right? We should enter into the vanaprastha ashram. But we see Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he stayed in the grihastha ashram basically his whole life, right? So we can see here, evam parampara praptam, I'm following in the footsteps of the Mahajanas. I can stay in grihastha life my whole life, right? No harm. And then Jayadvaita Maharaj, he spoke again very heavily, right? He said, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, the patron saint of over-attached grihasthas like yourself. These are very heavy words again. And then he said, Bhaktivinoda Thakur's grihastha life was more perfect than most sannyasis' sannyas life. In his grihastha life, he lived a more perfect sannyas than most sannyasis. Again, we shouldn't think of the external form of something as being the essence of something, right? Sometimes people will say, Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, he took sannyas from a photograph, right? From a photo of Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj. And we will say, oh, how can we have a proper parampara then, right? Sannyas Diksha was not done person to person. We do not have a proper sannyas parampara then, right? Some person might have this doubt. But this is nonsense, right? Because it is not the external form that defines our parampara. It is the essence that is flowing, right? Why we have a shiksha parampara, right? In terms of initiation, right? Our parampara is traced through that flow of that mood of bhakti through history. Same with sannyas, right? One might say, Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj was a Babaji, right? Is a Babaji. And therefore, he is not a sannyasi, right? But can we say his renunciation was not more perfect than any sannyasi, right? The Babaji platform is outside of the four ashrams, right? And can we say Bhaktivinoda Thakur is also not in that same sannyas parampara, right? In terms of that internal essence, right? Passing along. Anyways, so therefore we hear a Jamil, he is described as a brahmachari. We should understand this point. When he is described as a brahmachari, this means he was very perfect in his grihastha life, right? Very, very elevated. And so we hear this description. And so in this description, we hear that he was going along very nicely, helping his father along in Brahminical duties, right? Until one day, he came along and he saw, of course, a very low-class person, right? Of course, we know in Kali Yuga, everyone is a Shudra by birth, so this is common behavior for us to see, right? Remember once again, my spiritual master, he was describing at Ratha Yatra in LA once, Guru Maharaj, he was visiting. And during Ratha Yatra, he saw the ocean. And he thought, I should go and, is auspicious to chant one's Gayatri near a large body of water, right? So he thought, I will go there to meditate, right? And so Guru Maharaj, he closed his eyes. And after finishing Gayatri, he heard some sort of laughter and amusement. And he opened his eyes, and because he was at a beach, right? He saw all around him, everyone dressed in like their bathing clothes, right? And I still remember Guru Maharaj, he said very nicely, he said, everyone was wearing their kopin alone. That's how Guru Maharaj described it. And he said, I felt so embarrassed to be there, I had to run away. So Guru Maharaj, he said instantly, with complete shame, he thought, what sort of place am I in? And he ran away back to the Ratha Yatra, right? So we're used to seeing interactions like this, right? People just freely, interacting like this, right? But in Vedic times, and of course, were personalities like my spiritual master very much, heavily, strictly in one's spiritual and mode of goodness and mode of transcendental goodness. This is very, very different, right? And of course, Jamil was in a different time, right? So he saw this very low-class sort of person, right? And he was consorting with with, again, a not so very elevated woman, right? And we know, as described, he had like turmeric on his arms, which is considered, it's meant to increase lust when one places it on their arms, right? So he had some placed on his arms in order to increase the lust that was felt, right? And so, a Jamil, he saw this, and seeing this, it was very agitating, right? Again, last week I was speaking about one of my friends. He was in India, and he was visiting one of the Varnashram farms they have there, and he was telling me, he said, living how I do normally here, going there, I felt like a dog, I felt like an animal, right? Associating with how elevated and conservative, not in the sense of being socially conservative, but conservative rather in the sense of freely interacting with people were there. He said, even what I think of as appropriate dealings with other people would be considered completely inappropriate there, right? So anyway, so when you're not used to seeing such things, very much can be agitating. And so a Jamil, he was agitated in this way, right? A Jamil, he was very, very much disturbed. And it's described, interesting, in Srimad Bhagavatam. I'll look for the texts, but I don't want to go too over time. It's described that Jamil's initial response is he thinks, I will go and I'll observe dharma very well, right? But dharma fails him, right? He goes to the rules and regulations, and the rules and regulations, they fail him, right? He is not able to have any sort of shelter in the rules and regulations. And then he goes into meditation, right? And all he can meditate upon are his lusty desires, right? So there we find dharma or karma and jnana. Both of them, they fail a Jamil, right? A Jamil goes and he feels this lust, right? And we know lust is the central principle. Srila Prabhupada, he says this in one purport. He says only Krishna consciousness, only bhakti is powerful enough to separate the force of lust. Lust is such an essential force to this material universe. This material universe is born from lust, right? Quite literally, all life is born from lust, and the very world itself is born from desire to enjoy this world, right? So this force is so powerful, only Krishna consciousness, right? Only the beauty of Krishna can actually break this. And we see this with the Jamil, is described. When he tried to go into his meditation, all he could think about was his lust. When he went to go into the rules and regulations, we all know a Jamil did not end up being very regulated, right? So in this way we see lust, it conquers dharma, it conquers karma, and it conquers jnana as well. And as we know, hopefully I won't go, we should have time. As we know, by the end of the pastime, bhakti eventually is all that is able to conquer the lust. It is only once bhakti arises. We know Sridhar Swami, he describes, Prabhupada mentions in his purport, once the first Narayan is said, then we can consider bhakti had begun to sprout in a Jamil's heart. And at that point he says, oh, what's going on? He comes to his senses. Anyway, so disturbed like this, my spiritual master, he describes it. Actually, a Jamil, he went knocking on everyone's doors, right? And he said, where is this one, this lady that I saw? Where is she? And he was like this. He was so absorbed in his quest, right? So absorbed. Instead of meditating on anything spiritual, right? Again, jnana failed him. And his dhyana, his meditation, was only on this one woman. And so he would knock on every door and knock. And he would say, do you know where she is? Do you know where she is? Like this. He searched everywhere until finally he found her. And then he brought her home, right? And he said initially, when he brought her home, his wife was still there, right? And we know his wife, very pious personality. I often say this point, we miss this often in Srimad Bhagavatam. So often, actually, we speak the glories of individuals, but we don't speak the glories of their wives. But actually, their wives are glorified throughout. Bali Maharaj, Srila Prabhupada writes that Bali Maharaj's whole progress was basically because of his wife's transcendental understanding, right? We see the same thing with Sudama Brahmin, right? Actually, it's described by our acharyas that his wife was more austere than he was, because she would take anything she would receive through begging, and she would give it first to him, and she would take his remnants, right? So she was even in a more elevated place than him, right? So often, actually, we miss, right? We remember the husbands, but we don't remember the wives, right? And often, the wives are the better half, right? We can also think of the wives of the Brahmanas in Krishna book, right? So often, actually, it's the, and definitely in a Jamil's pastime, the wife is the much, much better half, right? And so, what does she say? She's there and she's very simple. And this woman who a Jamil has brought home, she sees the wife and she says, who is this woman? Get rid of her, right? She feels envious, right? And so, a Jamil, completely intoxicated, he tells his wife, okay, you've had enough time with me, you can go back to your parents, right? And a Jamil's wife, she says, why should I do that? I'm married, I'm with you. And then a Jamil says, no, you should go back to your parents. It's all right, just go back. And then she says, she's not stupid, right? And she says, I can see what's going on here. I can see who you've brought here, right? I can see what you're thinking. Just let me stay here, right? I've made the marriage vow. Even if you are going to do something incorrect, adharmic, at least let me try my best to observe the rules, right? So she says, I will stay, just do like that. And a Jamil, he thinks, okay, now what do I do, right? And so a Jamil, he keeps on going for a while like this. But then he finds some small reason. He asks, did you mix some turmeric into this sabji? Oh, this is not correct. This is not correct. What are you doing? Even though she didn't mix anything in. She was cooking perfectly fine. But he was saying, I don't like this. He was fault finding, right? Fault finding continuously. And then eventually he sent his wife away because he found all these faults, right? He found all of these very many faults. And then he sent back to her father and he wrote a note. And on the note he said, your daughter is very unchaste. She is not following the principles very well. I'm sending her back, right? We can see this is where lust can lead through, right? This complete hypocrisy, aparad, fault finding. And that's why we find karma, right? Lust, it's the heart of all of these other issues that come up. So like this, a Jamil he does, and he sends his wife away, right? So sending her away like this, we know he's committed very great offense. And what does he do then? He spends all of his money, right? All of his money he spends. All of the money his father had very nicely collected and obtained for an inheritance for him, the whole inheritance he spends as well, right? And so the whole inheritance is lost. And then, of course, we know inheritances, they don't last very long. And he has to keep on going, and he engages in lots of, illicit activities, right? He's doing all sorts of terrible things in order to make money. Why? Because we can think, right? It's bona fide to give gifts to one's partner, to one's wife, right? Actually, one should do this. This is considered the duty of a husband in Vedic conception, to give gifts and stuff like this. But this is normally allowed and fine, because a wife is also soft-hearted to the husband. They won't think, I will ask so many things. I will be satisfied with whatever's in the capacity of the husband, right? Because there is that stability in the Grihastha ashram. But this woman that Jamil has brought home, she doesn't care, right? This is not, we know Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he defines Grihastha ashram for Vaishnavas as when the two devotees together, they support their Krishna consciousness, right? This is not what's happening here, right? She is just here, again, based on lust. And so because of this, she's just milking him dry, right? She's just saying, whatever I can get from you, I want. And I will squeeze and squeeze and squeeze like that. This is not good enough. I want more, I want more, I want more, right? So like this. So because of this, Jamil, he had to do all sorts of criminal activities in order to afford it, right? And so, of course, we know the pastime. He names his son Narayan, right? And he names his son Narayan because, again, our acharyas, they comment on this. One cannot even chant Shuddhanam without some sort of association of the devotees beforehand. I mean, Namapas, also Shuddhanam, but Namapas, right? Or even Namaparad. In order to get some sort of benefit from the holy name, one needs to have heard it from the devotees, right? So somewhere, somewhen, there was some sort of sukriti a Jamil had, right? And that's why he was able to chant, well, firstly name his son Narayan, but also he was able to chant and receive some sort of benefit from it. So somewhere, somewhen he received that, right? Actually, it's also described, it wasn't even at the time of his passing that he just said Narayan, and at that point, all of his sins were cleansed away. Actually, any time he would see his son, and you'd say, Narayan, come over here. At that point, then his sins would be cleansed. Actually, it's described like this. It was a constant cycle. He would sin, and then he would sometimes see his son and say, oh, Narayan, come over here, and the sins would be cleansed away, right? This is what's described in the purports. But the reason why this was valid, we might think, oh, well, that's very good for me, I can, chant my 16 rounds, sin, and then chant them again, and then, Hare Krishna, right? The Vishnu Duttas will help me out, right? But actually, the reason why this is, is because he was not aware, he was not cognizant of what he was doing. If he was aware that this is what would be happening, he would get no benefit. Then this would become Namaparad, because he's using the holy name in order to excuse himself of sinful activities. But because he was fully unaware, that is the reason why he got the benefit, right? This is an ignorance is bliss sort of situation. So anyways, he's committed so many sinful activities. And then on his deathbed, he's about to pass away. And we know how many Yamaduttas come? 3. 2? 3. 3, right? And do you know 3 for which reasons? The 3, one comes for different sins. Yeah, there's bodily, mental, and verbal sins. So for sins that he's committed spoken, for sins he's committed in his mind, and for sins he's committed with his body, right? One different Yamadutta comes for each one of them, right? And we know it's also described in Srimad Bhagavatam, how many Vishnu Duttas come? 4, right? And the description that's given is, one is given for which reasons? Yeah, for each syllable of Narayan, right? So like this, both of them come. But Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, right? He speaks about when they come, right? He speaks about when they come. And he gives a very wonderful description, right? The Vishnu Duttas, they've come, of course, because he said Narayan, right? And one has come for each syllable. But there's a specific term that Chakravarti Thakur uses to describe why the Vishnu Duttas came. They came for the chanting of Hari Kirtan, right? They heard the Kirtan is being sung. They heard that the glories of the Lord are being sung somehow or somewhen, and therefore they wish to come for it. This is what Chakravarti Thakur describes. And so we can see here, this is the nature of Harinam. This is the glory of Harinam, right? Because when one chants Harinam, one is able to have the association of the devotees. And we know without the association of the devotees, what is the point of our life, right? So we can think, sometimes we can think when we are chanting, I'm chanting that I can have the association of the devotees. Because the devotees are not attracted to somebody who is chanting anything else than the glories of the Supreme Lord, right? And so in this way, the Vishnu Duttas, they came, attracted to the idea, oh, here is Hari Kirtan, here we will go, right? So this is instructive in three main ways, right? Firstly, when we chant, we can chant to have the great benediction of the association of the Vaishnavas. Secondly, what we can also learn is that if we aspire to become Vaishnavas, we should think, I will only go where Hari Kirtan is chanted, right? We should be like the Vishnu Duttas, right? Seeking out, where is Krishna Katha spoken? Where is Krishna Kirtan sung, right? Where are all of these things done? We should be like that, so eager, right? Even simply like this, somebody has said Narayan, oh, this is the association I want, right? And thirdly, we can learn what is Vaishnav Sangha? What is the association of the devotees? Sometimes people will say, oh, we're having devotees association and we're playing cricket together. And yeah, you're getting some sort of association. Yes, it's glorious even to be standing next to somebody who is chanting the holy name. But this is not what we mean when we say seek out the association of the devotees. When we say seek out the association of the devotees, we mean seek out those people who are discussing Krishna among themselves, right? This is what we wish to seek out. Right? And this is what defines it. If we are coming together as devotees, we shouldn't be coming together to discuss, all sorts of this and that, prajalpa, right? We should be coming together to say, oh, Krishna, how glorious is Krishna? Describe the beauty of Krishna, describe the beauty of the Vaishnavas, right? Recite the holy names together, right? This is what defines Vaishnav Sangha. This is what defines the Vaishnava. The Vaishnava is both always engaged in Hari Kirtan and is always eager to be around those who are engaged in it. So in this way we see the Vishnu Duttas, they come and they and they see a Jamil, right? And then as we know, there's a long discourse, and it's a famous discourse, but maybe we're getting towards the end of time. So with this discourse, basically, the question is asked, right? Very nicely, actually, we can see this is a wonderful description of how we as devotees should be. The Vishnu Duttas are, as we know, they're exemplifying Vaishnav qualities, right? Because the Vishnu Duttas, they have a much better understanding than the Yama Duttas, right? The Yama Duttas, they're confused. They say this person is engaged in so many sinful activities. Surely we can drag him down now, right? Surely he's our property, right? And of course, the Vishnu Duttas, they very sweetly, right? They have the conversation. And what do? They hear the Yamaduttas, right? This is what's described, right? They hear them. And they don't hear them because they're ignorant. Srimad Bhagavatam, it describes in the second canto of the 6th chapter, it describes that actually they are considered to be experts in logic and debate, right? Actually, they're experts in philosophical discourse. But an expert in philosophical discourse very nicely will firstly hear the opposing position before presenting theirs. It is not that arrogantly one should shout down at somebody, right, before they speak, right? Instead, they simply listen, right? And they hear nicely. They wish to understand what is your perspective before explaining the Vaishnava Siddhanta, right? So very nicely they hear the Yamaduttas say all of these things. And then, of course, we know the Vishnu Duttas, and they speak the glories of the holy name, right? And hearing these glories of the holy name, right, all of this becomes established. This is the central point, right, of this pastime. All of these sins have been atoned for, right? And of course, as I said, we're reaching the end of the time, so we won't get into it too much, but you can read, especially in the appendix of the 2nd chapter, very nicely. There's a whole condensed back and forth, but you're saying this and that, right? But we're saying this, right? They're doing this whole sort of samvad, right? Actually, my spiritual master, he says, this is a samvad, it's a conversation, right? So there's a samvad explaining the glories of the holy name. And so, in this way, we hear that even Namabhas, right, is such a wonderful thing. However, we do also hear a Jamil, then, actually he was definitely meant to die at that point. But, by the mercy of the holy name, he was given some extra time. And then what did he do? is not simply that he chanted Namabhas and he said, bas, done, right? I'm done now. I'm all set. Then he goes off and he begins to chant and engage in proper sadhana, right? So this is the last point, I guess, right? Namabhas is very glorious. And Namabhas speaks to the glories of the holy name, right? Oh, how sinful a Jamil it was, right? How sinful. And yet, simply like this, he had no issue. Actually, it's described by Chakravarti Thakur. It wasn't even when he said Narayana that his sinful activities were destroyed. Actually, when he said the first na, at that point, all of his sinful activities were destroyed, right? Even just the one syllable of the holy name was enough to already destroy all of his sinful activities. But the purport is that it is not simply enough. We are not concerned with destroying our sinful activities, right? Or extending our life. We are concerned with Shuddhanam. We are concerned with chanting the holy name purely, right? And we see this. A Jamil later on, then he goes and he commits to going deeper and deeper into the holy name. And so on that point, I wanted to share some points about the Chaya and Pratibimba Namabhas, right? Because for most devotees, we are not too concerned with these 5 types of Namabhas that are described here, right? We are intentionally chanting with some sort of faith, right? If any of us here are chanting, we are chanting because somehow or another we received the merciful association of the Vaishnavas. And through their merciful association, some Shraddha was born. We know there's the 9 levels of bhakti, and the first one is Shraddha, right? But actually it's described, we can say there is like a 0 stage of bhakti, right? Before that first stage, and that is Sadhu Sangha. The Sadhu Sangha that's described after Shraddha, this is Sadhu Sangha that is intentional. Now I have some faith, now I wish to associate with the Vaishnavas. But before that, the actual Shraddha, to wish to associate with the Vaishnavas, comes with unintentional. You meet a book distributor who, you weren't intending, especially if you go in book distribution, you'll hear the way they speak to you. They definitely weren't intending to have the association of a book distributor, right? They're not very happy often, right? But still, somehow, they're receiving the mercy, right? And in this way, that faith is born. So, and just because I'm running very close to time, I'll just quickly go over. There's an essential list that's described of how Namabhas arises for devotees. And they're born from anarthas. Ultimately, these anarthas are born from having asat trishna, having desire for that which is asat, which is not Krishna, which is not true, which is not eternal. Bhukti, mukti, and siddhi. When one has desire for any of these 3, what will flow next is hridoy dorbalya, weakness of the heart. And this weakness of the heart, it is found in all sorts of ways. It's found in attachment to things which aren't real, right? It's found in duplicity, it's found in envy, and it's found most dangerously in the desire for fame and prestige. If one desires bhukti, mukti, or siddhi, if one desires these, then naturally these things will arise. The weakness in the heart will cement. The desire will transform the heart, and then the heart will be cemented in envy, in criticism, in wanting to seem like a greater devotee, right? Or even worse, in wanting to be a great personality. And once that has been established, then aparads will flow. Once those are there, then one will naturally have all of the aparads. Nam aparad, Vaishnava aparad, Seva aparad. Sometimes people think Vaishnava aparad is very severe, but I can get away with Seva aparad. I can get away with Dham aparad. I can get away with Nama aparad, right? But actually, especially Nama aparad, the Vaishnavas and the holy names, they're so closely connected. When one offends the holy names, indirectly they're offending the Vaishnavas and vice versa, right? Together they're there. So all of these aparads are very severe. So in this way, one is blocked. One is chanting a shadow of the holy name because these things are not being rooted out. Bhanu Maharaj says the main way that we can unroot these is by having a proper understanding of Siddhanta, right? And so that's why Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he lists the other set of anarthas are Tattva Vibhrama. Tattva Vibhrama is an incorrect conception of the true nature of things. When one truly understands the nature of oneself, when one truly understands the nature of Supreme Lord, and when one truly understands the nature of our